Okay, and we are back, and with 11.0.5, we've seen some questionable class tuning. And whenever I say that, we had an insanely weird meta shakeup to the point where, some specs are getting nerfed by 8%. Some specs are getting buffed by 8%. Fire Mage randomly catching the Stray. We have Elemental Shamans doing the most ungodly damage I've ever seen. We have Enhancement Shamans being over the whatever the hell Enhancement Shamans are. We also have pretty comprehensive tuning on this weekly reset where things like, Balance Druid are getting buffed. Beast Mastery Hunter's single targets going down, but their AoE is going up. Amongst other things, Elemental Shaman's getting completely shot in the head, 20% AoE damage nerf, 10% single target nerf, not looking too hot for them. Where Enhancement Shaman is only getting about an 8% damage nerf. So, I expect it's going to be pretty good. And I think it's time to talk tier lists. We're just gonna make a tier list for the 11.0.5 changes. Obviously, I think I'm going to factor in the class tuning that's going to be happening on this next weekly reset at time of recording this to kind of talk about where we are with the meta and kind of what's going on. Of course, we've had a few weeks really to actually see since the beginning of the season, what actually was going on with the meta and how we kind of felt about some of the specializations. But I think with 11.0.5, there's probably not going to be too big of a meta shakeup, but we can kind of talk through how all of the specs are looking. Just giving a quick rundown of the tiers. Obviously, S is we have one in every single composition. A is a high likelihood of being a meta candidate. B is a best third DPS option. B minus is it's fine. If somebody came to you and asked you, how is this spec? You would respond, it's fine. C is unlikely to see play. And D is you should probably reroll it. You should be looking for something else. In general, I thought the metagame for DPS in particular was fairly solid prior to 11.0.5. Ultimately, that's kind of what you hope for every metagame to be, is just fairly solid, all things considered. All right, let's start off by talking about Aug Evoker. This is a meta candidate spec. You could, in theory, probably put this in S, especially if you go and look at the front page of Raider.io and whatnot. You can kind of go look at all the timed runs. Most of these involve an Aug Evoker. I'm going to leave this in meta candidate. There have been some comps that have been playing without a Balanced Druid. You saw this Kira Warrior comp. They were playing without a Moonkin. They were playing Assassination Rogue, Frost DK, Balanced Druid prior to the patch. I think that you can get away without playing an Aug Evoker, especially at a high level. I just don't think you want to. Here's the thing with the Aug. If you're doing a weekly key, the spec sucks. Straight up. The damage of the spec is also not the greatest thing ever, but we've seen this with Dragonflight Season 3 as well, where the damage that Aug Evoker provides is not the most important thing for high-end players to be able to utilize it at a proper level. The most important thing is the fact that it keeps your tank and your healer alive, and it can increase their throughput by a substantial amount. This is going to keep Aug Evoker in A tier. This spec is inherently just busted by design, to the point where until they stop buffing the tank and the healer, this spec is probably going to be in a meta candidate until it's complete garbage. Next up, let's talk about some of the A tier stuff. We have Enhancement Shaman as well. I think that this is probably the big winner of the patch. They're collecting an 8 to 10% damage nerf on the weekly reset with some of the stuff that's actually going into these changes. I think in general, it's Lightning Bolt, Chain Lightning, it's Tempest damage that's being reduced as well by 15%, which is crazy. This spec was far enough ahead to where none of that realistically mattered. This spec is still going to be fine. It's going to end up yielding a net buff from 11.0 to 11.0.5, and it was already one of the best specs on 11.0. So the fact that they're getting even a slight buff in comparison to that, that's going to be very good for Enhancement Shaman play. I think that this is probably the big winner of the patch. I think this is probably one of the specs that you're going to be designing your composition around at a super high level. Other A tier stuff. Let's talk about Frost DK. I think that Frost DK is absolutely phenomenal. I think that Frost is a specialization that has slid a little bit from 11.0 to 11.0.5. They ended up getting a very light nerf. I wanted to say it was 2.5% on AoE, 0.5% on single target. It was a very light AoE, all things considered. But in general, it's one of the specs that has slid a little bit, but you can't really be mad about the performance of Frost Death Knight. I think that, especially if you click at this as well, you can see that pretty much every run was running a Frost DK. And if you go to Mythic Stats, you can actually check and see that 25% of runs were running a Frost Death Knight. So if there was a spec that was supposed to be the one in every comp specialization for last patch, it was probably Frost DK. And I still didn't have them there because you didn't necessarily have to play with the Frost Death Knight, although it was good. Obviously, anti-magic zone and grips and whatnot are incredibly valuable on this season. I think that those are some tools that are incredibly potent and useful depending on the circumstances. Next up, let's talk about Assassination Rogue. Assassination Rogue ended up getting a buff, which... so the big downside of Assassination Rogue is that they did no single target, but they had probably one of the highest AoE caps in the game on last patch. Now they've received a 6% single target buff since then, and their AoE damage is staying mostly the same. They are getting a Master Assassin nerf, I want to say. So Master Assassin crit strike is going from 20% from 25%. In theory, this does end up hurting them a little bit, but I don't think it's going to end up harming performance just generally. Last spec I think I want to put in A tier is probably like Frost Mage. I think that Mage was maybe a little bit less good than people anticipated. Arcane received like 3 or 4 nerfs consecutively, mostly targeted at Raid. Then people ended up pivoting to Frost. You're seeing people like C Mage on China. I think you're seeing like Garchomps on OS. I think you're seeing like Riley on NA, making Mage look pretty solid. But ultimately, it looks like it's maybe a hair behind the curve. They ended up receiving a little bit of buffs as well. Frost Mage actually receiving 8% damage gain. They're still fairly far behind in Raid. I could actually see Frost Mage receiving another round of buffs, which, you know, it's good for their placement in Mythic Plus. The way that they're playing around, you know, Lance and their priority damage that they're getting from their Lances and whatnot is... fairly solid, all things considered. I think that it's just one of those things that they might not be in the highest DPS composition, but I think in terms of like meta candidacy and being able to time the highest level of keys, they're definitely on the table. You know, bringing group slows to allow your tank to be able to kite more and more is a super positive thing. And again, whenever you're looking at some of the top runs, you know, you see like Anuo playing with C Mage fairly consistently. You're seeing a lot of just Mage play in general. It's not like every single comp by any means, but you know, it's definitely a meta candidate. All right, let's talk about third DPS options, because I think that there's actually a lot of very solid third DPS option specializations. We're just going to kind of rapid fire through what makes them good, how they're going to be performing. I think that Shadow Priest, you know, they were already fairly solid. They ended up receiving another Psychic Link change. Psychic Link tends to be the most changed ability of all time and continues to be that, where their Psychic Link is, I think, is now going from 25% to 30%. And Psychic Link go from 25% to 30%. Shadow Priest was fine. It's not like the greatest specialization in Mythic Plus, but it brings things such as Power Infusion. You know, it brings Fortitude in this season where it's actually kind of hard to get Fortitude from some sources. I think that their damage, just overall, I've played with a couple of Shadow Priests. Their damage seems like it's pretty fine. I think that they make for an okay third DPS option. Obviously, I think the downside is that their utility is not great. Outside of Fortitude, you know, Fear is pretty lackluster. Their silence is kind of concerning, especially in a season which is so kick heavy, but they're pretty fine. Balanced Druid, getting a buff on this most recent reset, or this next reset rather, getting a 5% single target gain, getting a 2.5% AoE. I think that they ended up getting a nerf for Mythic Plus on the patch, on the anniversary patch, but so this is going to be about net even as to where they were before. I don't want to say net even. Maybe it's a little bit behind where they were before, but I think this is a specialization that is very likely to be a third DPS option. You were seeing it see a little bit of play on the last patch, and then it kind of died off as some of the other stuff has been pretty overpowered. Like, you know, Enhancement, I think, has been the big winner, and I think that kind of killed Balanced Druid a little bit out of the meta in terms of what we've been seeing. Now, I think that it's possible to play it as a third DPS option. I think it's possible that we see it at like a decently high level in some aspects. Arcane Mage, I think this is a fairly solid specialization. Particularly, it depends on the dungeon. I think that some dungeons like Mists of Tyrannus Scythe and like Necrotic Wake, where you can make really good value out of the burst profile that the Arcane Mage provides, I think is going to be phenomenal for the specialization. You know, again, good third DPS option. I think this is kind of a situation where you don't necessarily have to play Frost in every single dungeon. I think that some dungeons you would play Arcane in over Frost, and I think that that's kind of like how I feel about the two specs, is that you wouldn't just play one or the other. You could play them both in tandem and then have good success in that aspect of it. Other good third DPS options, I think that Survival Hunter is something that's like, so it was good. It was like low-key good on last patch, and then it ended up receiving a 6% single target buff and a 9% AoE buff. And to a spec that was already like low-key good, I think that this might actually be the top of like B+ for me, but I think it's still a specialization that's going to end up being underutilized relative to how good it is. If you go and look, Bansher's Banshees, I think, is like one of the top ranked hunters in the world. And dude, this guy's playing a decent amount of survival. And I think that it's just a specialization. While it is very solid, it's pretty underutilized. Yeah, like he's over 3,200 playing serve. I think that this is a spec that, you know, you just have to give it a chance. I think it also kind of needs a comp that realistically works with it. I just don't see like what the comp would necessarily be to allow a survival hunter to thrive. Whenever you look at what Banshees is playing, they're playing like this full fizz comp where they're playing like Bear Druid Warrior. We're playing like Bear Druid Warrior, DK, just like full melee Zug comp, and you know the survival hunter fits in fine with that. But I don't know where it fits in necessarily with the broader meta specializations. But I think it's a really solid third DPS option. I think the problem is like it's not a spec that you're going to build your composition around. It's not like an enhancement shaman that you're going to build your comp around, right? It's not like an Aug Evoker that you can build your comp around. It's like really good though. But then you kind of compare it to some of the other A tier stuff. It's like, would you bring a Serve Hunter over like Frost DK? And the answer is probably not. Unholy DK. I think Unholy DK is really good, even though Frost DK is good. I think that Unholy DK has shown that in a couple of dungeons in particular, such as Necrotic Wake and such as Arakara, it can be better than Frost even. Now, obviously, this isn't every single situation, but I think that there have been some points in which Unholy DK, just the overall damage that they provide is better than Frost on some dungeons. I think that the specialization is quite strong relative to how underutilized it is, and that's mostly off the back of Frost DK being absolutely brainless and easy to play. So there's a couple of other specializations that I could probably put in B+. I'm just trying to think about where I want to put some of these. I would probably put Ret Paladin in B+. Yeah, I would probably put Ret Paladin in B+ at this point. I think the damage that Ret Paladin is doing is actually fairly solid. I don't think it's like the best third DPS option that you can necessarily provide. Kind of similar situation to Survival Hunter. I just don't see where it fits into compositions in the metagame. I actually think that the best composition for like a Ret Paladin would probably involve something without an Aug Evoker, right? So like a 3 DPS composition is probably Ret Pally's best bet. I think that, you know, the damage that they're doing, the utility that they're providing is all fairly solid. I don't think it's like the best specialization in the game, but I don't think it's like necessarily that bad. I think it's like a very viable third DPS option for a lot of groups. All right, let's move on to the B- it's fine tier. First up, I think I'm gonna have like Aff and Destro lock both here. I think that both of these specs are fine. It's one of those situations that I don't think that either of them are like that great. You know, you're seeing like 3,200 IO Warlocks in some aspects. I think a lot of them are actually ended up playing Destro over playing Aff, but I think that both of these specs are okay in their own ways. Destro's been on a little bit of a tuning roller coaster. All 3 Warlock specs are actually getting buffed on the reset as well, which if these buffs didn't happen, they were maybe looking at candidates for like C tier. But you know, with the strength of these Destro buffs, I think that that's probably keeping these specs in its fine tier. These are like Destro's maybe a marginal third DPS option, but I think that right now both of these specializations are okay. I would put Demonology in the unlikely to see play tier. I think it's just a little bit outclassed by the other 2 Warlock specs. Just in terms of like, you know, Destro does most of the same stuff that Demo does, except just does it a little bit better. And so then it's just like, it becomes this weird spot where it seems like it's unlikely to see play just on the whole. Other B- specializations, I suspect that like Sub Rogue is going to end up being in the B- specialization. I think Sub in particular is like a spec that's not bad, but I think it's really just outclassed by Assassination overall damage and just the way that Assassination's actually playing these dungeons. I think that it's a specialization that if it was the best spec of Rogue, it would be fine, but not great. Obviously, it wouldn't be like a super high meta candidate or anything like that, but it would be certainly playable. And then with that, we'll put Outlaw in the unlikely to see play. Even though Outlaw was bug abusing and, you know, running up the damage meters and doing all of that, the fact that they had to do that and the fact that they had to do that to see more broader compositional play, I think is pretty telling as to just Outlaw itself. I don't think that Outlaw is in a great state for Mythic Plus. I think it's like, you know, playable. It's fine. It's maybe fine, but I think it's really unlikely to see play, especially whenever you compare it to some of the stuff that's better than it, particularly to other Rogue specializations. So it's like, why would you even play this? I think Fire receiving a nerf makes it unlikely to see play. It was dead coming into the expansion and received a bunch of buffs in a row. I think that this is fucking terrible for Fire. They ended up receiving a 6.5% single target damage nerf on the 11.0.5 coming into the patch. I think that was completely unwarranted for fire. I think it just ends up being unlikely to see play because of things like that. I think Fury is fine. I think Arms is unlikely to see play. They ended up receiving pretty extensive buffs. I wanted to say it was like between 5 and 8%, both of these specializations, to a bunch of different builds, where now I want to say Slayer isn't even like the best pure AoE build for either Fury or Arms. I think that you in general want Slayer to be the go-to Mythic Plus specialization, just because of how it performs, or like how it actually plays inside the dungeon. I think it's a specialization that Fury is fine. I think that Arms is unlikely to see play. I think that Arms is like mostly the go-to single target spec in some aspects. I think that both of these specs have been catching just unwarranted nerfs. I want to say that like Fury ended up getting both of these specs ended up getting target caps on a couple of their abilities. That's not very good for their broader metagame play. I think this is a situation where Fury is fine. Arms is really unlikely to see play after these changes. Okay, so Beast Mastery Hunter I think is actually fine now. Beast Mastery Hunter was complete garb for a while, and then they ended up receiving a couple of different buffs. I think the Dark Ranger Beast Mastery stuff, particularly on AoE, and then another buff on top of that, it really does help BM in the long term. You know, you have things like your multi-shot damage doesn't really contribute too much, but stomp damage increase, barb shot. Like they were looking to actually, they say Beast Mastery is overperforming single target, and we'd like to reduce its single target while improving its lackluster AoE. I think that's pretty good. I think that this probably ends up putting Beast Mastery in a situation where it's fine. It was dead for a while on the patch, but I think it's definitely moved up into it's fine. Not even necessarily in the unlikely to see play tier, but like I don't think that Hunter is going to see like a large amount of meta game play unless it's like Banishers or something like that. And especially like, dude, like if you look at like the most recent runs prior to the patch, Hunter wasn't taking up a big piece of this pie at all. And so I think this is a specialization that's like, it's like playable if you really want to play it, but I don't think it's like that great. Marksmanship is probably in the same tier as BM, where it's like fine. I think that both of these are actually unlikely to see play in just like terms of like a broader metagame composition. So it's like kind of tough to actually put them in B-, because like if you talk about the representation, they're probably both in C tier. But if you talk about like the strength of like how much damage they're going to be doing, it's probably B-. So I don't know. I feel like you can just probably put them in B-, and both of these are going to be okay. I don't think that either of them are anything to write home about. But again, if you look at their like how many runs were being seen with Hunter, it's just like such a small amount. Put Ele Shaman in unlikely to see play. Put Dev Evoker in unlikely to see play. I'm gonna put Windwalker Monk in unlikely to see play. Oh, I put Havoc Demon Hunter in, it's fine. And then Feral Druid in, it's fine. Okay, so let's kind of talk about these all together. Ele Shaman ended up receiving a 20% AoE damage nerf and a 10% single target nerf. I don't think that it was that far ahead. It might have been that far ahead on AoE, but I don't think it was that far ahead on single target. My suspicion is that this is going to take a spec that was a meta candidate spec and move it all the way down into unlikely to see play, because I think the single target's going to hold it back a lot. I think that the AoE damage nerf, a 20% AoE damage nerf, is probably something that you can get away with if you were that far ahead like Ele Shaman was, but it still wasn't great, right? That would have probably moved it into its fine tier. But whenever you start chipping away at how much single target a spec does, particularly in Mythic Plus scenarios, that really makes it difficult to be willing to like see those specs be played. They have to be doing like an overwhelming amount of AoE damage to contend with like a lackluster single target, and then Elemental Shaman's not doing that. So I think that this spec is actually it was a spec that was a marginal meta candidate spec for the entire expansion, and now is completely in the gutter. Dev Evoker, I think that Dev Evoker is just completely outclassed by Aug. I don't think that Dev Evoker is a spec that has particularly good AoE, sustained AoE damage itself. I think a lot of the damage, like it's a spec that's absolutely phenomenal in Raid, and Mass Disintegrate and Scale Commander in Raid is great, but I just don't think the way that they necessarily play in Mythic Plus with their sustained AoE and how it's actually performing right now is something that you're looking for. I just don't think it has like that upper cap of sustained AoE that a lot of these B+ specializations have, because like if you look at all these B+ specs, their AoE cap is like way higher whenever you're comparing that to like a Dev Evoker. Windwalker Monk. Windwalker Monk is kind of funny. Windwalker Monk is funny because you actually see I don't say decent, but you see like some play in terms of Windwalker occasionally with things like Dabnell. He ends up, I think he's like 3,200 playing Windwalker Monk. So it's playable at like even a really high level. But I think it's just a specialization that, again, it doesn't really have a good comp to fit into. The overall damage that the Windwalker is doing is not like great, especially if you compare it to other like niche melee specializations. If you compare it to like other niche melee specializations, like a Ret Paladin, like a Havoc Demon Hunter, like a Fury Warrior, I think I'd probably take most of those over the Windwalker Monk, which is a bit unfortunate. So I think it's really unlikely to see play. I think it's unlikely to see broader metagame compositional play. Havoc Demon Hunter and Feral Druid. I think that Feral is like fine. I don't think it's great. Again, I think that like if you wanted it, it would probably be for something like Mark of the Wild and like the general utility that the Druid kit provides. I think that it runs into some other issues of like, where are we fitting this into our composition? Will we drop a Frost Death Knight for that? Probably not. Will we drop an Assassination Rogue for a Feral Druid? Probably not. Are we dropping, you know, a Ret Pally or an Unholy DK for a Feral? No, I don't think so. And kind of the same thing is true for something like a Havoc Demon Hunter, where I think that this is a specialization that can be fine. I think it can fit into some compositions okay, but I think in terms of like the throughput and the damage that it's providing, it's a little bit behind the mark. And that's it. I'm not going to put anything in dead. I don't think anything is inherently dead. I think that the only things that were dead were like, you know, BM Hunter and Fire Mage on expansion launch. I think that obviously there are going to be some long shots for some specs to actually see meta play. You know, like if you want to like change this to from unlikely to see play to be dead, most people that's probably how they're going to view it. But yeah, that's going to be it for me today. I hope to see you guys in the next video, and I will see you guys later. Goodbye.